Alright, I'm going to go ahead and kick off the webinar. Good morning, everyone. I am Taylor Post, SWFLN's Office Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Accessibility Points, C is for Courage. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Christine Druhl. Christine Druhl has a PhD in American Studies, a Master's in Comparative Religion, a Bachelor's in English and Religious Studies. She has spent the majority of her career in higher education, teaching humanities, religion, diversity in the United States, educational philosophy, and writing at a variety of institutions in Michigan and Florida. She also has experience working with nonprofit organizations and federal grant management, working to enhance services and resources for people with disabilities. She is a creativity and accessibility consultant, keynote speaker, and presenter. Please welcome Christine and enjoy her webinar this morning.
Thank you, Taylor, for that very kind introduction. I am not seeing Diana's video going for signing. Is that something that I should be concerned about, or is that... Oh, here she comes. Awesome. Hey, Diana. I just want to make sure that we have on a webinar about accessibility, make it as accessible as possible. But thank you so much, Taylor and Diana and everyone who is attending today and taking time out of your very busy day to spend some time thinking about accessibility and courage. I sincerely appreciate your support and interest in this topic. Accessibility is very near and dear to my heart. I also have to apologize for the quality of my voice. I have contracted in the last day or so just a very significant cold, so I'll try to mute my speaker if I have to blow my nose, and I appreciate your patience. It's just one of those things, I guess I'm gonna have to muscle through. But in any case, I'm not necessarily an expert on courage, but I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to do some research and reflect on this topic. As Taylor mentioned in the introduction, my background is primarily in higher education and nonprofit, and I've always thought that the defining characteristic of a class or an assignment or a project is at the end of it, we have more questions than answers. And since I consider myself a lifelong student as well, and I'm guessing that a lot of you being in library sciences do as well, I'm hoping by the end we can have a better understanding and ways to practice courage in our ongoing endeavors to make our libraries more accessible and to increase our levels of courage and overcome some fears. So I just want to again thank you very much for being here with me today and in this webinar. So just a quick check-in. Again, no right or wrong answers here, and I just want to kind of get an idea of who is attending. If you could just take a minute for my own framework and to make this as useful as possible, and if you feel comfortable doing so, just type in what kind of library you work in, and yes, if you attended or listened to afterwards any of the other Accessibility Points webinars. That would be A is for accessibility and C is for cultures. And if you want, you can add in any of these questions as well. What do you hope to gain from this webinar? Why are you attending? Is there a particular aspect about courage, accessibility, or disabilities that you would like to address or understand better today? Again, just so I get an idea, it doesn't matter if you have or have not, although I recognize some names, so I'm pretty sure several of you have. But I just want to get an idea of, how much, how familiar you might be with the topic. And it is my intent to go a little bit faster at the beginning of this webinar, and kind of the first couple slides are, some background and definitions, and then, because I'm assuming just a little bit of familiarity with this topic. So, that would be great. Be mindful. Hoping to find ways to express our recognition and acceptance of disabilities. Awesome. Thank you. Academic library and one other webinar. Awesome. Open to teaching and learning anything. That's good. No particular goals. Good, because we can work with that. That's for sure. I appreciate you writing in the chat box for this. And I am going to request that you feel free to write in that chat box at any time. You're never ever interrupting me. I would like there, let's see, here we go, Kimberly, STEAM librarian at a public library, attended other accessibilities, courage, vulnerability, linked, awesome, yes, absolutely. How to be sensitive to the needs of our patrons, perfect. All right, first time in this series, but we'll go back and view the completed webinars, time permitting. I get that. Isn't that always the case? Time permitting. Awesome. So we do, thank you, Opal, and thank you, Kimberly. We have some wonderful opportunities that you can get on the website of SWFLN for recorded webinars, and I'm going to briefly just go over those too. So awesome, good deal. And again, also in addition to using the chat box, I would like you to view me as a resource anytime now or anytime in the future. If you ever want to bounce ideas off of me, my contact information will be at the end. You will have access to the slides, so don't feel like you have to quickly copy everything down. There are some handouts and notes. We'll go over that in a minute, but I think that would be great. And okay, Renee, attended the previous sessions and love learning, no goals. Awesome. Okay, we can do that. I just think it's important to kind of have, just to check in to see where you're at and where I'm at. And again, the handouts for today, if you've printed them out, that's great. It's not necessary that you have, but that we are going to go through a worksheet at the end. So if you have the capability to print it out, as we're going, you are good multitaskers. Basically, these are just the two handouts. One's a worksheet for the notes and some fear processing exercises, and then the second is just a variety of courage quotes. And I know that we all multitask, so we're not going to go through and read all of these quotes, but if you have printed it out and you want to look at that along the way, it could spark a question or an idea that you can enter into the chat box as well. All right, so, and then this is, and again, just the idea that of these pictures too that I've put in there, I've tried to pick ones that were relevant and would, kind of help spur the discussion. This little picture here of the mouse and the cat. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than the fear. And I think that is really important to know what is most important to you and have some idea of your own values and beliefs and fears regarding accessibility and serving patrons with disabilities. And remember, disabilities can be hidden or visible. So it's, I think it's just important to connect with that. So again, if you have the handouts, that's awesome. Print them out, have them handy. We're going to go through them. And then if not, that's okay too. Okay, so my goals, again, I like to have goals. We can get sidetracked, but I just want to kind of have them for you. So very brief reminder about previous SWFLN resources connected to accessibility. Very brief definitions of accessibility and disability and ableism, which is really the culprit behind all of why we're doing what we're doing here. And then define and explain, this is the bulk of the webinar, define and explain different kinds of courage and how each might relate to people with disabilities and accessibilities. Also to provide some examples, I think, of what courage might look like and what lack of courage might look like, because I think it looks very differently for different people in different contexts. So I'm going to try to give you some examples there, and then as we go, of course, if you think of other examples, again, put that chat box is yours. Define and explore fear. A little bit less time on that because I think we all have a pretty good idea of what we might be afraid of, but how it might negatively influence our interactions in people with disabilities in very subtle ways. And then I'm hoping at the end that we can go through some scenarios, work through maybe that fear handout, and just kind of process a little bit of this. And maybe some tips and activities and questions to help develop courage and work through fear. So those are kind of my goals for the session today. Okay, so again, very briefly, these are posted on SWFLN's website. There are lots of webinars, but these are specific ones that are dealing with resources and pre-recorded webinars on how to better serve patrons with disabilities. And I think that there's some fantastic stuff in here. So take a look at those, even retake a look at those, because there's plenty of things in there that you can relearn. The other thing too is the Diversity Discovery Institute. these have a lot of overlaps, and this is kind of an ongoing series as well. So again, you can kind of take a look if you haven't seen these or you haven't seen them in a while. This has been going on for 3 years now, and we're still going. So I think that, not just even the ones that are kind of obvious, like social justice or respect or stereotypes. There's a lot of ones in here about, culture and, just empathy, that, all of these are ways that you can, I think, develop courage and have a better understanding of what you can do. And I think it's just a good idea to review these every now and then and sharpen your tools and your toolkit. A lot of you indicated in the chat box you love learning. That is so awesome. But in our learning experiences, I think we bring who we are to that process. And since who we are is constantly changing, there's always new things to learn and see and hear, even with the familiar. So, it's, like reading a book again the second time or seeing a movie again. You always see things, you always hear things that are different and new. So again, these are great resources. And then, of course, you're in the middle of this particular series, the accessibility points, and today we're going to be talking about courage and the way that it influences our patrons, ourselves, our work. The previous ones so far have been accessibility and culture. That's culture of compliance and culture of gentleness, two very different things. And then upcoming are empowerment, and then special needs and safety coming. We're kind of just going through them one a month, and if you have any ideas too, I just wanted to let you know I'm always open to suggestions. These are in process development that SWFLN asked me to do. These are not things that I have. I'm doing them one at a time. So if you have suggestions on things that you think might be good for these, by all means, email me. I'd be happy to incorporate any resources that you think might be beneficial. Again, I appreciate any help that you have, and I'm easy to contact. So I appreciate that and would appreciate your thinking. So just take a minute to breathe, to think about what the word accessibility means to you and all of the things that may be connected to you for you and your libraries. I want to express my gratitude again for attending. As I mentioned, this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I have raised a son, my stepson, Talon, who has Fragile X syndrome. It is a genetic disability resulting in some cognitive and developmental differences. And he is, quite coincidentally, probably the most courageous person I know. And he loves libraries. He cannot read like most of us read, and it was actually through one of SWFLN's earlier webinars on resources for people with disabilities that I learned about a text-to-speech app that, with a little practice, he can now read texts. And an entirely new world has opened for him. He has this app that, he copies the text in and then his phone reads it to him. He just loves it. And I just think that there are so many ways that libraries can help with accessibility. And I just, while I'm thinking about it, I just want to thank you for all of the ways that you have already made your libraries, your service, your programs more accessible to people with and without disabilities. It matters. Okay, it really matters. What you do every day matters. Your presence here today matters, and I am just very grateful for that, and your ongoing interest in learning about this topic. Okay, so again, I'm just going to keep rushing through this beginning part till we can get to the meat and potatoes of this of this presentation. So, broad definition of accessibility. So you have the person or the patron served, you have the disability, which again could be visible or hidden, and then you add in your library's response or an accommodation perhaps. All of those things together, I think, create a culture of accessibility. And then I think they combine, but they're constantly changing. So your people are constantly changing. Your patrons are changing. Your policies change. The only thing constant in this world is change. So while we're trying to define and confine and clarify, that in and of itself is an ongoing process. So my definitions and way of explaining things here today is only meant to get the conversation started. to help us get to the point where we can start asking some really difficult questions that can help keep us moving forward and creating greater and greater accessibility. And the particular kinds of accommodations that we're going to be talking about today are mainly internal, and they're connected to our emotional and intellectual responses in our daily work. So, we're not really talking too much about physical accessibility today. This is more of a internal and an emotional type of accessibility. Okay. And think about, too, your definitions of accessibility and what it means to you. I think that's just an ongoing self-evaluation that is useful. So another definition that I find very useful is the degree to which someone can use something in his or her environment or society. It has a common application in regard to people with disabilities and access to a service or physical space. So I think that's really where this webinar fits too, is that service or access to the service or physical space. And it shows that the accessibility is, it occurs on many levels. It occurs on many levels, and I think we have to be aware of that when we're trying to improve it. And again, defining disability, we can't really go talk about accessibility without disability. Defined in a variety of ways. These are used differently by professional organizations, groups and individuals with disabilities, and government organizations and projects. In particular, okay, so library services for people with disabilities. If you haven't been here, you might want to go to this particular site, and you can really see, this is connected to that professional organizations point. You have a lot of resources at your disposal. There's guidelines in a variety of areas where accessibility intersects with libraries. And it's not just about, as you would expect, ADA compliance and the laws. There's a lot of different other areas here. You look library services or collections or assistive technology, employment. That's one that often gets overlooked because not only are we serving patrons with disabilities, we should be employing patrons with disabilities. And the ALA recognizes we're not doing a very good job of that overall. I think gaining ground, but again, it's difficult. So there's some really good resources on here, ongoing training and education conferences. I think that they can better help you serve your patrons with disabilities, and it's right under their website. Very, very accessible, and some great things there. This is currently my favorite definition from the World Health Organization. Disability is not something that a person has, but it's something that occurs outside the person. It's a functional limitation. And the disability occurs in the interaction between the person, his or her functional ability, and the environment, including physical, communication, information, and social and policy environments. Again, so there's many layers to this, but it's that interaction that is important. So I think that that is what you are going to learn today. I think while it applies to everyone, it's particularly designed for people with disabilities. So I think that courage and fear, we're all disadvantaged at times. We all need help. We are all afraid in some ways, courageous in other ways. We could all use some encouragement. Do you hear that? Encouragement once in a while. And so I think that there's some specific knowledge here, but I'm not trying to minimize the fact that people with disabilities visit your libraries every day. But a lot of this stuff is also applicable to people without disabilities, and I'm hoping that you can gain some things that are specific and also broadly specific or broadly applicable to your service. The World Health Organization also, again, I like it because it emphasizes function over diagnosis. We can't always see a disability or diagnose it. It equalizes physical and mental functional limitations. It kind of levels the playing field, saying disability is an ordinary part of experience for all people, and then we can just kind of minimize the experience of a disability by making accommodations and designing our environments intentionally. This is kind of an ongoing thing. So, and again, this is the real culprit, ableism. So, I have to put this in here because this ism, this fear-based discrimination, this is really at the heart of what we're battling here. Ableism is a pervasive system of discrimination and exclusion that oppresses people with disabilities. It's a system in which people without disabilities maintain supremacy over people with disabilities through a set of attitudes, behaviors, social structures, rewards, privileges, and benefits of the society that are available to individuals according to their presumed level of ability. Ableism operates on individual, organizational, institutional, cultural, and societal levels. And again, this is really what we want to be vigilant for. We want to fight this whenever we see it. It's a tricky ism. It's deeply rooted, but I firmly believe that with courage, we can minimize ableism and work towards its elimination as well. So that's just kind of the general place of where we're at and what we're really going for. Okay, so let's get to the heart. Let's get to the heart of the matter now here. Courage. All right, so what I would like you to do is if you could take a minute in your handout, if you could get, have your handout ready, excuse me, take a minute to define courage. There's a space for you to write it, or, if you don't have the handout, write it in your notes. Just what do you think courage is? There are no wrong or rights here. Many, many definitions, and no cheating. Don't look at the courage quotes. I want you to dig in your own idea, and if you can, just jot down some ideas in the chat box, and we can kind of see what where we're all at with this. I've got 3 different pictures here that might might kind of help. For the first one, just a rock with courage, because I think courage sometimes, the rock is a good metaphor. You're strong, you're solid, you're brave. Courage takes that kind of hardness, and you get there, but yet at the same time it's coming from a place of softness of your heart in there, but you have to be strong when you are courageous. Of course, the cowardly lion, oh, we got a definition here: facing fear and being able to move forward among obstacles and challenges. Absolutely perfect. You probably should have consulted with you, and you could have helped me here, Kathy, with that. Courage is the ability to move forward despite fear. It can happen with both positive and negative situations. Awesome. That's a great idea. Yeah, it absolutely can. I think that is so important. That and the end result isn't always positive either. Sometimes you get to the end, and I'm going to give you an example for a little bit. When I ask you to think about ways you've been courageous next, I'm going to give you an example where I exhibited enormous courage, and then at the end, everything just fell apart. The cowardly lion, again, you can kind of think about that, but it'd be nice if we could just kind of go there. He was awarded courage for being brave and overcoming his fears with, Dorothy and getting to Oz, but, it was something really he had within him all along. If you look at the little wordy there, facing fears, within, knowing, knowledge, daring, great, there's obstacles, of course, many things in there for that. So again, there are many definitions of courage, and I think it's important to kind of know what you mean and know what you have, kind of going for you. As you know, probably if you've attended webinars, I kind of have a thing for etymology, and so I wanted to just give you this, and I've been emphasizing the word heart. I don't know if anyone got that, but this is primarily because of the word origins from this, coming from Old French, the heart, the innermost feelings, temper, Latin, again, courage, and, coming from core, heart, or and again, just the ideas of a common metaphor. It's coming from there, and so we're really talking about here is heart. Courage involves the heart, and this works on several levels, as we're going to look at different kinds of courage. So in the back of my mind while researching this material, I kept coming back to the heart, and involving inner strength, passion, compassion, caring. This involves the physical heart, the emotional heart, the spiritual heart more. Okay, there's a lot of levels of the heart that we can talk about. To develop courage to overcome fear, we have to intentionally be aware of where our heart is. And when we are interacting with our patrons, we need to be aware, or at least consider, where our patrons' hearts are, or our coworkers' hearts are, when they bring us their questions, their problems, their assignments, their tasks. I understand that sometimes it's all we can do to just plain get through the huge numbers of requests and tasks that we have to do every day. But just taking a little bit more, having some courage, means connecting to your heart a little bit more and the hearts of those around you. So I think that is, that's kind of a useful way to go about thinking about that. Okay, so just some definitions of courage again, and I realized when I was reviewing my notes for, I don't know, the third time this morning, I think, I forgot to put in a picture of one of my favorite definitions of courage of all time, but if you want it, you can have it again, or just email me, and it's something to the effect of it does not always roar. Sometimes courage is just the ability to say quietly, I'm going to try again tomorrow. And I really love that one. But here are some other ones here. The one from Nelson Mandela is a pretty common one. I've learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel, but he who conquers that fear. Again, supplement gender inclusive language there. That's fine. Courage is simply the willingness to be afraid and act anyway. And again, not the absence of fear, but the acquired ability to move beyond the fear. I think that is, what I'm taking away from this is that if you think about it, courage is a process, okay? It's a state of being that involves or interacts with, but moves beyond fear to a different way of experiencing. And it's you might have points in time that are courageous, but it really is a process. And you can't get to courage without experiencing fear. And don't worry, like I said, we're going to get to fear in just a little bit. So I would like you to, if possible, the next area of your handout talks about list ways that you have been courageous, or in other words, ways you have demonstrated courage. And again, if you are willing to share these, awesome, put them in the chat box, and we can certainly work with that. While you're thinking about this, I'm leaving this slide up because this is where we're headed, just to give you kind of maybe a nudge in the direction of ways that you may have been courageous that you could share. While I want to share just a little bit of a story that I alluded to earlier about a way that I have been courageous. So in 2012, I voluntarily resigned 2 years from tenure from a position in higher education in Michigan. And I thought at the time that my husband and son, who I mentioned has a developmental disability, I thought we were going to be embarking down on the adventure of our lives, taking a sailboat. I live in a sailboat. We are boat and water people, down the east coast of the United States to eventually live in North Carolina. And as if the adventure of intentionally derailing a perfectly healthy academic career did not require enough courage in itself, a million questions and fears were swirling in my head daily about my son. So how would he handle it? He relied a lot on routine. This journey would have very little of that. He was also navigating between his mom and stepdad, who we shared custody with. I'm his stepmom. They had put their house up for sale, agreed to relocate, and alternate time from month to month with our son. Everything was changing for him, but he seemed to be handling it very well as the logistics developed. It was a dream come true for us. Michigan winters are brutal. It's been delightful living in Florida, but I'm jumping ahead here. There were so many proverbial balls in the air. Fears, financial, career, maternal instincts, the physical journey. I thought it took a tremendous amount of courage on my part to do it. There were some amazing moments. We sailed by the Statue of Liberty. We avoided Hurricane Sandy. A lot of stuff that the movies are made of. But, I don't want to discourage you, but the whole thing failed. We made the journey. Our son did fantastic. He grew in leaps and bounds, but basically his mom freaked out. Once we were down in North Carolina and I was job hunting, she changed her mind. She refused to let our son travel to be with us while they moved. They took their house off the market. We never agreed not to be parents, so we had to basically sell the boat and move back to Michigan with nothing, try to figure things out. Courage helped me get through, though, find a new career in nonprofit that I never would have considered had I stayed in that comfort zone. It actually eventually led to the SWFLN position, doing workshops and webinars for SWFLN, because I had to, I looked weird now to the academic folks. It's a very dramatic story. It fits this webinar, but I'm sure I'm seeing some examples coming in here from some folks. Let me see what we got in here. In December, I moved to a new state, Florida. Yay! New job, new home, starting a new life. Oh, this sounds exactly like this. Yeah. Leaving abusive marriage, awesome. And getting a second master's. Look at you, helping your son graduate. Wow, Kimberly. Paling there. And overcome physical disabilities due to injuries. Oh, my goodness. Yes, absolutely. So many things in there. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that it's those dramatic stories are powerful. They're inspiring. They're, heart-wrenching. But, the little things that you do every day can also have a huge impact too. So, if you don't have, I'd just like you to just reflect on the ways that you're courageous every single day. Okay? I think that, you could have dozens of examples. Things you do on a daily basis that demonstrate. Public speaking could be courageous for some of you. Being kind to rude patrons or colleagues, perhaps, I think is courageous. Not getting riled up in crazy traffic can be courageous. Sometimes coming to work on a Monday can be courageous. Smiling at someone when you yourself are struggling can be courageous. Being grateful can be courageous. Showing empathy instead of apathy or anger can be courageous. Standing up for those who need help can be courageous. And this is, like I said, I think that these are really ways that you are courageous every day. You might not necessarily think about it. The courage quote on this slide says, "Courage is doing what you are afraid to do. There can be no courage unless you're scared." So again, we'll get into fears in a little bit, but I think that it's important, and scared, and fear, again, they manifest in different ways. Maybe you wouldn't use the word fear or scared. You might be stressed, though, or you might be nervous or uncomfortable. Those are, kind of partners, kissing cousins, if you will, of fear. So sometimes that can manifest. So I think that to think about courage in a little bit deeper levels here, I want to go in a little bit more deeply into 6 different areas of 6 different kinds of courage. Physical, social, intellectual, spiritual, moral, and emotional. Okay, so you might not, might not have thought about some of these areas, and I don't think that that these are the only kinds or only ways that you can demonstrate courage. But for time constraints and what we can actually do in our time together, I just wanted to have, I wanted you to have some ways to focus. Okay. So I think that, and I also would like to kind of talk about when we go through these examples that of, ways that might look like. What might physical courage look like? What might spiritual courage look like? And what does the lack of it look like too? Because sometimes we can, recognize something by its absence as well. So that might help you kind of maybe unpack some of those interactions with your patrons or colleagues, like, what is going on here? So perhaps you can, kind of think about that. So, and I also tried to encourage in these examples some, like, examples that are applicable to children as well, because I know a lot of young people use our libraries, and a lot of you work with youth in different programs that might certainly help. So, okay, let's go through these. So physical courage is the type that most people think about first, one that allows us to risk discomfort, injury, pain, or even death. Okay, running into a burning building, facing an enemy on the battlefield, chemotherapy, climbing a mountain, protecting a child from a dangerous animal at some point. Physical courage also involves recognizing that our bodies are how we participate in the world. Keeping them healthy, strong, and resilient prepares us for all kinds of challenges, not just the physical ones. So these are interconnected layers of courage. So some of the things I think that you can relate to with the physical aspects of courage are, maybe some examples are getting up after falling down and trying again. That could be literally or, physically falling down. Training for a marathon. What about resisting the temptation to eat junk food and making healthy food choices instead? You might have thought of the fact that you need to do that for your physical well-being, but you might not have connected the fact that doing so is indeed courageous. You're intentionally making a choice that will help you. Maybe meditating for more than 15 minutes without falling asleep. That's my thing. If I get 15 minutes and I meditate, I'm usually napping. Exercising regularly. Some of these, when I was going through these examples, I was starting to feel convicted, like, wow, I've really not been very courageous in some of these. Enjoying the outdoors, no matter the weather, and exploring the world. A lot of times, we get caught into that routine, and we're in our cars, and then we're in our houses, and then we're, in our workplace, and we kind of forget that beautiful world outside that we have. Trying new sensations or experiences, sports, exploring all senses or trying to be aware of touch, taste, hearing, sight, smell. And then, of course, when we layer on that lens of accessibility, you might be thinking about whether if you have a disability or your patrons have a disability, what ways that disability might limit this experience of physical courage. Let's look at some of the lack of physical courage. What might that look like? Holding back or hiding. You kind of go back into the corner. You don't want to do anything, or you avoid eye contact, perhaps. Giving up after you fail one time. If I had given up and just said, oh my goodness, giving up really isn't an option, right? I don't know, you get there, but, you have to, at some point, muster up your heart and try again. Clinging to unhealthy habits. This one got to me, caffeine, chocolate, I've got weaknesses. And not necessarily that you can't, always have physical, optimal health. We all, want to be couch potatoes, but avoiding physical challenges, ignoring doctor's advices, or using maybe a prior injury or a frightening experience to scare you out of trying something new. Again, shying away from new foods. Or perhaps using too much of something to dull your feelings, too much food, too much alcohol, drugs, to dull your sensations. Again, that's the physical, physical feelings that, you're trying to avoid there. So, and again, thinking about this in terms of your physical, patrons with physical disabilities, that, they might have added layers of physical challenges that might limit their physical courage. So just something to think about. All right, so physical courage. That's the pretty common one, okay? Let's look at some other ones. Social courage. Social courage. Standing up tall, being able to greet the world in our with our head held high, feeling comfortable in our own skin. Social courage means not conforming to the expectations of others. It means being willing to show our true self, even if it means risking social disapproval or punishment. I certainly experienced this with my physical journey. When I told folks at my institution that I was resigning my position, they're like, don't do it. Just don't do it. You've got a great thing going here. And I'm like, I have to. This is just great. We're going. It'll be wonderful. Again, lessons learned. Well-meaning, well-hearted folks, but again, my journey, not theirs. And sometimes, the best advice, hindsight being 2020, I looked and I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should have taken a leave of absence. That might have simplified some things. But I wouldn't have ended up here. This is like the second stage of the journey that we got. We actually did end up down here, and our son is living with us. But that's another story. So in any case, it sometimes you just don't know how that's going to pan out. You have to just embrace the journey in the moment and that uncomfortableness of, okay, now what? Now what do I do? Social courage means being able to express opinions and preferences without checking to see if they are in line with everyone else's opinions and preferences. And social courage also helps us apologize and move on. You know, it's that interaction. I was wrong. I'm really sorry. Let's move forward with this. What does social courage look like? Having a personal style and sticking to it, regardless of what fashion or the media is saying at any given point. Perhaps performing in a play or concert, delivering an oral report with confidence, organizing a charity event, volunteering as a mentor or a youth group leader, finding role models who reflect our own values, stepping away from a clique or from drama or politics that have become unhealthy, standing up to peer pressure, shaking hands and introducing yourself. That's a big one, especially if you think a lot about kind of developmental disabilities. That's a big one for my son. His social communication skills have grown by leaps and bounds since he has moved down here with us, but maintaining eye contact has been something that has been very difficult for him his whole life. And you know, introducing himself, he wouldn't do it. He would just stand back. So he's experienced that. Being on time. This was one that kind of surprised me. You know, punctuality can sometimes mean, you know, that you're you know, being courageous, you're connecting with your heart to the system of which you are a part. Admitting your mistakes, apologizing, keeping your word. That's all aspects of social courage. Here's one that also might be a one you hadn't thought about. Asking for a raise. You know, again, that's being comfortable in your own skin, your own worth. A lot of people have a lot of fear about that. So, you know, again, the fear would be the lack of courage or the obstacle you have to overcome. But that might be something that, you know, that happens. And, you know, as we'll see in a little bit too, you know, the outcome is not as important as the process of going through it. So if you do decide you want to ask for a raise and there's just no money to be had for a raise, you're not going to, that outcome will not be perhaps what you would desire. But the point is that you went through that process, that you were courageous with that, and that in and of itself is important. Lack of social courage, you know, chasing what everyone else is doing in fashion or the media, allowing others to make your decisions, standing at the back of a group photo or presentation, gossiping, being a bully or a passive bystander, forgetting or refusing to vote, you know, refusing to try to make new friendships or avoiding situations where you don't know anyone and there's going to be that social interaction, waiting around to see what others do first, running away or not owning up to a mistake or an accident, you know, texting or Facebooking bad news to a friend instead of doing it in person. I know that sometimes you don't have the choice, but you know, all those, you know, kind of avoiding that social interaction. And again, remember that these examples of, you know, lack of, or examples of, you know, these different kinds of courage are just possibilities. This is an exhaustive list. Again, if you can think of other examples of ways to be socially courageous, write them in the chat box. I think courage is a very individualized process, and it develops in individual ways. What might demonstrate great courage for one person might be very common or ordinary for another. Walking into a library for the first time might be an act of tremendous courage, or, you know, asking for a raise might be easy. Again, I'm not trying to, you know, say that these are one size fits all, do all lists, but just getting you to think about different ways of this. Okay, so intellectual courage. Intellectual courage means being willing to grapple with the difficult or confusing concepts and ask questions, being willing to struggle or gain understanding and risk making mistakes. In terms of accessibility, sometimes just asking the question, is this program accessible? Is this language accessible? is this, whatever, flyer accessible? And try to gain an understanding and, look at it and say, no, it really isn't. Let's try again. Sometimes what we learn challenges previously accepted ideas or contradicts teachings from a family or cultural group. Would require intellectual courage to think yourself through that. I think that intellectual courage will be required more and more in the future. We have a lot of complex structural problems in the environment, the economy, and society, and these just challenge conventional problem solving. We've got to think differently, and intellectual courage, and thinking with that your head and your heart is really what we need more of. Intellectual courage means being intrinsically motivated to learn and question rather than being extrinsically motivated. Some quick examples here: asking questions, listening to questions. Again, I think that a lot of you, this is going to resonate with most of you in your work in the libraries. Working on puzzles and thought problems. Studying music or memorizing poems. Disagreeing with your own mind. I love that. You work out that argument. Seeking out opposing viewpoints. Deciding you'd rather have peace of mind than be right. Curiosity. Reading banned books. Taking as long as necessary to learn something rather than being satisfied with a superficial understanding. Offering opinions, listening to others' opinions. Those are all things that I know you do on a day-to-day basis. Okay, lack of intellectual courage looks like, of course, not asking those questions, not listening to questions or the answers, giving up very quickly on new material or new ideas. This one I was totally convicted on this one. Not admitting that you don't know. No, wait, I got that wrong. Admitting that you don't know. Sorry. Admitting that you don't know. That's very difficult for me, because that is something that is socialized and enculturated in academics. You are supposed to know the answer. But you could phrase that in a good way. I don't know right now, but let me help you figure that out, or let me help myself figure that out. Repeating facts without questioning them, and not recognizing connections between ideas could indicate a lack of intellectual courage. Pretending you don't know what you really do know, like not opening bills or test results. Accepting the first answer, just, quickly get it done, not asking that additional question of, is this okay? Is that all we need to know about this? Okay, so that's intellectual courage. Again, feel free, if you have other examples, type them in. Moral courage. Moral courage. We got Mark Twain has a very famous quote there. It is curious that physical courage should be so common in the world and moral courage so rare. What do we mean by moral courage? It means doing the right thing even at the risk of inconvenience, ridicule, punishment, loss of job security, or social status. Moral courage requires that we rise above the apathy, above complacency, hatred, cynicism, fear-mongering in our political systems, in our socio-economic divisions, in our cultural and religious differences. I think that those are key words to think about. So whenever you come up with that, you could just make the association, wow, I'm coming up with an opportunity. This is a lot of hate here. This is a lot of fear here. I'm coming up with the opportunity to be morally courageous. I think that that's, some examples could be, helping, push somebody's car, off to the side of the road, even if it helps being late to work. Standing up to a bully, picking up litter. This is one thing I like to do. My husband is sometimes like, that's so gross. I'm like, no, it's important. I'm trying to make this a nicer place. And, refusing to listen to or repeat gossip. Example of moral courage. Practicing what you preach, even when no one is looking or knows. Turning in a phone or wallet to lost and found. That's morally courageous. A teen who might call home for a ride from a party where alcohol is being served. Okay, I'm going to get in trouble because alcohol is being served, but I need a ride, and here we go. That's a morally courageous act. Company whistleblowers, risking job loss, financial cost, or legal repercussion. Reporting a crime. that you see. You see the kind of program, if you see something, say something. That's exhibiting moral courage. Participating in a peaceful protest. That's another one. And kind of another thing about moral courage is, I think that, it's connected to a cause. The picture of the person standing in front of the tanks there. When a cause is more important than anything, you are demonstrating moral courage. Doing the right thing means listening to your conscience, that quiet voice within. Ignoring that voice can lead to feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and diminished personal integrity. Moral courage requires us to make judgments about what actions or behaviors are supportive of our highest ideals and which ones are destructive. And honestly, just taking some time out to make an inventory of your highest ideals, okay? And kind of seeing what that is. What are your values? What are your ideals? This is, if you've attended previous webinars on this is part of that cultural iceberg, that deep part of those values, those attitudes that, that can truly change the way that we work and experience the world. And moral courage asks us to recognize our own responsibilities and see the consequences of our own actions. Lack of moral courage, some examples of lack: walking away from someone when you know they're in need, taking more than your fair share, laughing at someone's misfortune or accident, grabbing the spotlight from someone who has earned it, taking credit where credit is not due, placing too much reliance on the letter rather than the spirit of the law. That could happen in terms of policies and procedures that you might have placed in your library. Again, not necessarily laws; they are more like policies and guidelines, but it's applicable. Remaining silent. You can exhibit lack of moral courage by just not doing anything when you know that there's something going on that's wrong or an injustice. Rationalizations or justifications. Well, I'm not going to do this because, even though you know that it should, your lack of action. And one of the activities, hopefully, that you will do at the end is that, kind of what is the dangers or the risks of acting or not acting. Action and inaction can both exhibit a lack of moral courage. Breaking a promise, and of course, some that are obvious: lying or cheating. That's not what we're going for. But okay, so spiritual courage. Spiritual courage fortifies us when we ask questions about purpose and meaning. Many people can find these foundations in organized religion, but there are also other ways to develop spiritual courage. Spiritual courage means being available to those deeper questions about why we are here. What are our lives for? Do we have a purpose? It's hard a lot of times to ask those deeper questions. Sometimes we get caught in the routine and we're just kind of going through the motions of a day-to-day, but we have to take time and ask those deeper questions every now and then to develop spiritual courage. Spiritual courage means accepting that we are unlikely to find the answers, but we keep asking them anyways. Again, the point is not the answers. The point is that we ask the questions and engage the process. The answers will change. This is one of the most difficult things that I found to in my teaching. I'm still very much teaching online, and students are just like, tell me what you're looking for. Tell me the answer you want. And I'm like, no, that's not really the point here. The point is that you're asking the questions, that you're going through the process. If you come up with different answers with the same question, that's okay. Millennials are particularly uncomfortable with that, so it's been a kind of a challenge with that. You have to call upon spiritual courage when considering your own mortality. Spiritual courage means opening yourself up to our own vulnerability and the mysteries of life. Some of the ways that we can demonstrate this is attending religious festivals and listening to stories from other faith traditions than our own. And I think that these questions can be very frightening, which suggests, I think, why there's a rise of fundamentalism, and all these different quick answer movements can gain mastery over us. We want definitive answers, and we're attracted to those answers rather than uncertainty. Taking time, making time to pray or meditate, do charitable work. Again, these are examples of spiritual courage. Holding a funeral for a pet. I love this one. I mean, it's so sad, to think about, but, wow, it's like that was spiritually courageous. Letting go of the need to control everything in life. Reaching out to others in time of need and asking for help. That's also an aspect of spiritual courage. And I don't, that one I was convicted on as well. I don't like to ask for help. There's lots of resources in communities, and I think that that's important for us to remember. We don't have to know everything. We can ask for help and we can collaborate. Building meaningful rituals into your daily life, such as quiet contemplation with a cup of tea or coffee, or a walk in the woods with your kids or a friend. Lacking spiritual courage, making judgments based on religious identification. Refusing to attend religious services even when, your child or somebody else invites you or expresses interest in them. Maybe refusing to attend someone's wedding or funeral or another rite of passage because, of religious intolerance. The inability to question your strongly held beliefs. Trying to, I'm comfortable with what I know. Why do I want to think about that? Just kind of thinking about that. Not being willing to make a values inventory. Not walking the talk, basically. You say that you're saying one thing that you believe, you're doing something else. There's a disconnect there. And just in general, one thing that resonates with a lot of the other webinars that SWFLN has done, a lack of respect for others, their beliefs, their culture, their environment. There's a lot of overlaps with the cultural issues, again, so just remember those previous webinars can really help us. All right, so another one, emotional courage, being open to the feeling of the full spectrum of emotions, of experience, both positive and negative. I think one of the previous definitions managed that. Absolutely. There can be development both positively and negatively with this. Often the term emotions and feelings are used interchangeably, but I think it's worthwhile to take a second to be more precise. Emotion is the complex psychophysiological experience combining our internal, biological, response to the external, environmental stimuli. Okay, there's a lot in here, so think about this when when you have some more time. So emotional courage is being willing to experience, or willing to be vulnerable, truthful, and aware of our conscious experience with core emotions, which we think about and often express in language as feelings. Okay, when we choose to ignore, suppress, or deny our emotion, we risk a reduction of insight, leading to faulty decision-making, inaccurate mental representation of our experience. There's a ton of stuff on there on emotional intelligence. Emotional courage is very much connected to it. I want to just kind of give you some examples of emotional courage, and as we think about this as well. Helping friends grieve a loss. Confronting a family member about abuse or addiction. Some of the examples we've had, I know you've had this experience, so I, commend you for being emotionally courageous. Crying in a therapist's office, or crying in general, or laughing so hard that the tears come. Forgiving someone you love, that's really hard. Forgiving yourself is included with that, because you should love yourself. Taking in an injured animal, these are all examples of emotional courage. Crying without embarrassment, helping a stranger who is in distress, sometimes even just acknowledging that distress. Geez, I see that you're really looking upset right now. How can I help? I'm sure you do this all the time, but it's one of those things that, boy, I'm developing courage, just being aware of your intention to do that. Maintaining eye contact and smiling. Of course, working in, as you do in serving the public, or, social workers or counselors, or, lots of folks, who serve the public are, demonstrating emotional courage every single day. I love this picture, of the fox there. Having a soft heart in a cruel world is courage, not weakness. So researchers are kind of saying, getting back to that difference between emotions and feelings, there's basically 10 core emotions: anger, fear, sadness, enjoyment, disgust, surprise, contempt, shame, guilt,
embarrassment, and awe. And again, depending on whose research you're looking at, some of them don't put anger in there. They treat anger as a secondary emotion and fear is the real emotion. But again, we're trying to get at the core for this. So, I mean, it merits some reflecting. Emotional courage also means loving ourselves, being proud of ourselves, believing that we are worthy of love and happiness. You cannot give that away unless you have it. It's important to develop that. Essentially, it's related to self-acceptance, and it goes with a willingness to move outside comfort zones and explore new ways of being that may not be familiar. Emotional courage means being willing to give our heart without expecting anything in return. Some lack of courage, looking away, avoiding, or lack of emotional courage, looking away, avoiding eye contact. We know how powerful that is. If you did the culture of gentleness idea, the eyes, it's so important to be there in that presence, especially with someone for a disability. And again, recognizing every disability is different. Sometimes direct eye contact is very difficult for people, and that is more threatening. So it's a matter of knowing your patrons, or knowing what's comfortable for a person. Walking away from an emotional situation, that's indicating a laugh. Laughing or mocking or otherwise dismissing someone else's emotional response. A lot of times we're not recognizing emotions as a way of exhibiting courage. Embracing the victim role, remaining in the victim role. Numbing feelings, again, through overuse of drugs or alcohol or gambling. Again, you're trying to avoid the feelings, so you're doing these other things to do that. Losing your temper, blaming others for faults or failures that you're covering up in yourself. How's that saying goes, if you're pointing your finger, there's a couple of them pointing back at you. It's so much easier to see our own faults in other people than it is to see them in ourselves. Never being willing to be alone, and kind of checking out of your life through obsessive behaviors like too much TV watching or shopping. Those are all ways that we can exhibit a lack of emotional courage. Okay, so just something to think about too, 6 attributes of courage. Maybe you could assess whether or not you've done these things, and that could give you a place to reflect on, wow, I'm really more courageous than I thought. Number 1, feeling fear yet choosing to act. That's kind of at the basis of all the definitions. Again, just following your heart is courageous. If it's connected to your heart, you're working around the vicinity of courage. Number 3, persevering in the face of adversity. Not giving up. Number 4, standing up for what is right. Number 5, expanding your horizons, letting go of the familiar. That's a tough one. Facing suffering with dignity or faith. Giving that there. Again, that might give you some clues as to ways that you might be expressing courage. I like the picture here, the kitty cat with a silhouette of the lion. Decide mentally that you are going to have more courage than fear in every situation you encounter. And remember that's one of those intellectual courageous things. You've made the decision, doggone it, I am going to be courageous. Okay, and you will. You put that intention and awareness out there, and it will happen. This one's this is huge. I mean, honestly, we could do an entire webinar on this slide. So I'm not going to go into it in very much detail, but I want you to maybe go back to this at some point and unpack. And if you can, just for a second, see if there's anything that you could type into the chat box of one of these that you think you might struggle with the most and why. At least write it in your notes. But again, 15 ways to show courage. I'm going to go through these very quickly, but if there's a particular one that resonates with you, follow that up with some reflection. Give up and this is all about giving up. Losing, walking away from these particular behaviors. Give up your attack thoughts. Give up your need to defend yourself. Give up your need for approval. Give up your need to complain. Give up your need to numb your pain. Give up your need to judge, to struggle, to control others, to be famous, or not even famous, just to get recognition sometimes. I mean, that's a tough one. And a lot of this, too, can connect to whether you're introverts or extroverts, or whether the people you're serving are trying to, get particular attention. Give up the need to wear masks. to hide yourself. Give up your need to take action. Sometimes doing nothing is courageous. Again, assessing the situation. And of course, the contrary can be true. Give up your need to not take action. Give up your need to be distracted, to find fault, to be busy, to compare. I think that, think about the ways that you interact with your colleagues. I'm just kind of wondering which of those you struggle with the most. That might be a very interesting conversation. And a lot of this is getting to the heart of overcoming fear and being courageous. It's an us versus them mentality. We fear being attacked, so we attack or put our defenses up. Complaining points to a lack of, a fear of lack. It's a lack of resources, a lack of control, a lack of understanding. When in reality, if we're being courageous and acting from the heart, we realize that we have a lot to be grateful for, that there's an abundance of resources and creativity. We collaborate, we transform. All these things are available at all times. It's a matter of focus. And again, this is at the heart of the difference between, the focus of disability versus accessibility. What are you focusing on? The lack of, or the, accommodation of, the abundance of? I think that, we also accept a lot of labels and stereotypes rather than seeing past the facade and embracing the purpose. So if any of these, resonate with you, that would be a very fruitful place to explore. Okay, just briefly some benefits before we get into some of the fear. Benefits of courage. Acting courageously generally makes us feel good. It involves mastering emotions. The very fact that we're celebrating courage so much tells us that it's a very human activity. Courage in the sense of acting in a way that responds to risk appropriately, not acting overconfidently or in a cowardly way. It's a kind of a balance. It will also help us accomplish positive and good things. Courage also helps us to act against those who threaten or act in a bad way. We're going to talk about that with fear in just a sec. Success is not necessary if we show courage. That's a key. I think that's a key point. Success is not necessary if we show courage. You can fail. You could have a completely, from one perspective, me failing and having to go right back to Michigan after we took that journey. You might say, oh, wow, I failed. But honestly, it took a little while for me to see it. But I realized, wow, I gained so much more. I was successful in, creating so many new and different things that I couldn't have before. That, it's a matter of defining it. I love the quote by Maya Angelou: "Strong women, precious jewels all, their humanness is evident in their accessibility. We are able to enter into the spirit of these women and rejoice in their warmth and courage." I think that's so important. Celebrate courage. When you see it, when you see it, call it out. Say, wow, that was really awesome. That was courageous. Thank you for, for doing that. I think that's really important. Okay, so just we have to at least give ourselves some moments to talk about fear. Again, you can't get to all that wonderful stuff we talked about courage without working through fear. So there's your etymology. Again, some predictable things in there. Sudden danger, calamity, sudden attack, peril, ambush, perhaps. I love the Latin connections to pair, which is through, to try, or risk. In other words, you have to move forward or through something to get through that. So these are pretty old origins for us with this fear. We've been dealing with fear for a long time. I think that you have to have some definitions of fear for yourself. Again, if you want to add a definition, that's absolutely fine. But I think the importance here is that you have, have a working definition of it. Here's one for you if you didn't want to, kind of come up with your own. Fear is an emotional response induced by a perceived threat, or could be a real threat, which causes a change in the brain and organ function as well as behavior. Fear can lead us to fight, to hide, to run away, or to freeze in our shoes. It's that fight, flight, or freeze, kind of mentality. Fear may arise from a confrontation or from avoiding a threat, or it may come in the form of a discovery or new information. I like this little idea. Fears are the stories we tell ourselves. But a lot of times, we can rewrite those stories. if you're aware of the story that you keep telling over and over again at the source of that fear, you can rewrite those stories. I think that it's important to think about that. And I think that also this response, can come in the form of a relationship, or it can be expressed in emotions, and these could really be expressed internally or externally. And we try a lot. The fear is tricky because we try a lot to hide our fears. And so I think that it's, that's where some of that masks, comes afraid. It's okay to be afraid. In fact, if somebody admits they're afraid, especially yourself, that should just kind of put a little light bulb on in your head about, wow, I'm afraid, or I'm really worried or nervous about this. Ding! Here's an opportunity for courage. So it's a matter of flipping it. You're not going to ever avoid the fear, but you can work through it. Anger sometimes also hides, tries to hide or mask fear, particularly, again, I don't want to get off track, but there's some very interesting gender subcategories in here. Men are often, it's more acceptable for men to express their anger rather than it is for women. Or if sometimes, I don't want to stereotype, but sometimes if you ask a man how he feels, he's going to say 9 times out of 10, I'm angry. Because that's really about the only acceptable emotion he's allowed to, has been socially conditioned to allow. But in any case, it's that can also be an indication of fear as well. Fear and disability, again, we want to keep kind of the focus back to this. Many people are afraid that they will do or say the wrong thing around someone with a disability and offend them. Therefore, they avoid or avert their own discomfort by avoiding the individual or, the disability that might be in front of them, or, asking the question about how can we make this more accessible or accommodating. You're just afraid you're going to mess it up. But with meeting any person from a different culture, frequent encounters can raise the level of comfort or, raise your level of courage as well. So I think that, it's important to think about that. And again, fear and disability, depending on our perception of a particular disability, we can have an expressed or unexpressed fear, and or the confrontation with our own frailties, our own mortality, or our own struggles. And I think that the best way to do this is to, try to just eliminate that idea of focusing on the disability. Focus on that person. It's a person first, and a disability does not define. If you can do that, you can develop that social courage. And again, I've used this picture before because I love it. I have amazing eyes, an infectious laugh, and I always know when you need a hug. I also have Down syndrome. It's a part of me, not a definition of who I am. I think it's important to really think about that, and I think that we just have to kind of come to terms with your own ideas of, how do you feel about different disabilities? How do you feel about yourself with that? Why, is there any discomfort or fear that you have? And these may be very unconscious. You have to do a lot of reflection, to kind of dig in there. But, sometimes they're there. Okay, some things to remember. According to most definitions, there can be no courage without fear. Okay, fear is an emotion. It's connected to survival. It's not a feeling. Feelings are often manifestations of emotion. So, kind of that distinction between feelings and emotions. Getting back to that root. Anger, stress, and guilt often disguise fear and are based in a lack or a less than viewpoint or position versus an abundance position. And there's many ways to overcome fears. The quote here by Gandhi, "The enemy is fear. We think it's hate, but it's fear." There's just a ton of resources out there on how to overcome fears. These are usually, what I saw in doing the research for this, I saw a lot on particular phobias. So again, while this is disability based, if you have a fear of spiders or snakes, there's tons of things out there that you can find a lot of resources and step-by-step guidelines on how to overcome this. So I think that, again, lots of resources out there for help. Okay, so some scenarios and applications, if we can. Again, pull out your handouts again, and if you want to go through some of that, we can. I want to make it clear. I'm not asking you to post your fears out in the chat box. That's too. That is not a. That's not a very kind or accessible thing to do. But one of the things I would like you to at least consider trying to do is going through and maybe working through this on your own, and then posting in the chat box, what did you learn from this? So the first one I have on here, exercise 1, a handout, is just called fear, like as in an acronym, FEAR. And if you can, just in your notes, jot down a couple of ideas of some situation that you currently fear. And again, if you don't want to put the label of fear on it, it could be a current stressor or anger. That could be clues. But, let's just take a look at the acronym. The first one for the F is face the fear. Okay, can you name it? Can you define it? Describe it. What do you feel physically when you think about it? Try to get as many details down on paper with this. And again, I'm just, trying to give you a couple tools to process this. The second one, the E, empathize with yourself about this fear. Workshop or webinar a couple weeks ago on empathy that had some good techniques for this. But write some statements that show kindness and compassion to yourself about this fear. Some examples could be, many people have a fear like this. Or, it's okay that I'm afraid. Or, fear is a normal and understandable reaction to this. I like this one. I am not my fear. I am more than my fear. Or, I am working through this fear. I am working on this fear. Another way to empathize, I am a courageous person in many other areas of my life. Or, just in general, facing my fear can help me build courage. Again, face the fear, empathize with yourself. Third one, accept the fear. Accept yourself with the fear. Accept the desire to overcome the fear. Write down some statements that indicate that you are not resisting the fear. You are accepting it as part of your own path, your own progress, your own process of growth. Examples of some statements could be, I accept the fact that I can learn from this fear or this situation. I accept the fact that I have this fear. I accept myself completely with this fear and without it. A lot of times we would try to resist those fears, and so I think that this is an important part of this 4-step process to accept it. And then see if you can resolve it. I mean, I know we can't do a one-size-fits-all and resolve everything in a webinar, but try to at least come up with 2 actions that you could take that could help you process this fear. It does not have to be huge steps. Some examples could be watch a TED Talk that explores this fear or something related to this fear. Or write a poem about this fear. Somehow get what's in your head out in this external world in concrete form. Write a letter from you of the future, having conquered this fear, to your current self, still working on this fear. Okay, resolving is with tiny steps. Lots of tiny steps. Each day makes progress. Okay, that's kind of the first exercise that you can do to go through this, and then again apply this to your patrons. Realize that they're struggling with their fears, and where can you meet them along the way? Maybe it's just simply empathizing with them, or just being able to accept them for who they are with their fears and try to help them anyways. Again, a lot of times it's that mirroring that we're doing with each other. We're seeing them, our own fears mirrored in them a lot easier than not. Again, the next one on this is this handout for these exercises, using past experiences to help work through present fears. Again, I'll just quickly read through this. If you can do these right now, great. If not, do it when you have some quiet time. Think of a situation as an adult where you felt afraid and yet you chose to, face your fear. What did you observe, think, and feel at the time? What did you or the people around you say, think, and do to help you face your fear? At what point did the fear start to go down or lessen or go away? How did you feel afterwards? Again, connecting back to those emotions and those feelings. Now, and again, think of a situation in your childhood where you faced a fear. How is it same or different from that first situation? And then think of a situation that you're currently facing. What are you most afraid of? Okay, and trying to kind of go through that. And then seeing if there's a way that you can apply your previous lessons and skills in those 2 earlier situations to become more courageous in this situation. Remind yourself that you have these skills, you have used them before, and be aware of what mental or environmental barriers that are standing in your way of using these skills. You know, why, what is about this particular fear that is getting in the way. And again, try to come up with some, you know, coping mechanisms or getting rid of those barriers. This is another kind of idea to think about, and I think that it would be a great way to kind of think about if you have particular examples of you know, what you might be facing in fears, but scenarios that you are, you know, facing to in work. Again, you know, questions and exercises to work through to develop courage. What am I actually afraid of? You know, can you name it? Is it the right thing to be afraid of? You know, this could actually be, you know, almost a you might think you'd be dealing with one fear, and then suddenly you realize, wow, there's really a deeper fear. There's something I should be even more afraid of here once you start unpacking it. Should I be afraid of this, or rationally, should I be less or more afraid? What harm can this thing or the situation actually do to me or others? What could happen as a result of my actions or inactions? What's the worst that could happen as a result of my actions or inactions? And what are the risks to me and to others? Again, courage gives us the strength to evaluate an emotional response, fear, and act rationally and rightly. Again, connecting, you know, back to that intellectual and that moral courage. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone has any scenarios, please enter them into the chat box. I have a couple that, you know, we could unpack, and I'd like you to kind of take these questions that are on the screen here, and, you know, imagine that you have the situation or the scenario, and see if we can apply this. So I'm going to give you one just in the interest of time, that maybe we can process for a second. So how about so here's the scenario. A coworker is continually using the phrase handicapped patrons. So for example, if you've done previous webinars, they are not using person first language. Okay, first of all, that word handicapped is charged. So if you had this situation or the scenario, okay, see if you can apply these questions and, you know, determine what are you actually afraid of confronting this person. So if you can, you know, mentally think about that and perhaps write your answers in the chat box. You know, you have a coworker who is using this phrase, handicapped patrons. This does not resonate with you. You know, is there something that you're fearing at the base of this interaction? What harm could come? Any of these questions that you have the answers to for this, that would be great if you could just kind of, you know, process this. These questions could be used for any particular scenario. What's the worst that could happen? You know, if you do not, you know, call this out, or if you do call it out, what are the risks to me and others? Okay, I'm just going to give you a couple more scenarios just to kind of think about these in another way. Two kids, well, let's give them ages 8 and 9, come into your library and start laughing at an elderly person in a wheelchair who is struggling to reach and use the copy machine. Okay, that's your scenario. If you can answer any of these questions, again, this is a tough thing to ask you at the end of a webinar, but I'm still gonna push. Again, you'll have this slide. This is another tool that you can use for it. Two kids, ages 8 and 9, come into your library and start laughing at an elderly person in a wheelchair who is struggling to reach and use the copy machine. What would you do? You know, any of these questions, what harm could come from that? You know, what could it harm to you or from the other people? You know, what are the dangers of, you know, how could you maybe even seize that as a teachable moment for those kids, but also, you know, use it as a positive experience for that person in the wheelchair. How about a third example, just a scenario? You notice several areas in the employee handbook that do not address providing accommodations for people with disabilities, but you know they should. What do? How do you address particular situations and policies and procedures? You know, some of the, you know, that might be something that you might want to think about. Or it wouldn't even have to be an employee handbook. Again, what if it's a program or a flyer? You know something isn't accessible, so, you know, what's the worst that could happen? Number 4 there, as a result of your actions or inactions. Obviously, if you do nothing, the situation will not change. But if you act, you know, trying to unpack, you know, are you afraid of anything in this situation? Why would you not want, to increase accessibility in this particular area. This one, again, might be kind of fun on a Friday. It might be the last thing, and it's not necessarily connected to accessibility. But, you wake up one morning and you decide, I want to quit my job. Okay? Not necessarily connected to disabilities, but it might be fun for a Friday. But again, that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. But what are you actually afraid of? Again, this could apply to general fears, or this could apply to specific fears. But, these 5 questions can really help you unpack that fear and then work more toward a more courageous position for this. I just think that it's really important to recognize that having the fear is not really a bad thing, because that gives you the starting point for the being courageous. Again, I'm hoping that some of these tools, those exercises on the handout or that one would be useful. And keep in mind, I think that the main takeaway here is facing fears, developing courage. These are processes. They take time, they take attention, they take energy, they take effort. It's not something you can develop in a 90-minute webinar or in a day, but small steps, small intentions add up to very large gains. And the end result is that we become better equipped to provide services, information, create welcoming environments in our libraries to help all people, including ourselves, to become better people. Again, here's my contact information. I know that Taylor or Aaron will post this webinar shortly on the SWFLN website, but I, please hope that you would, see me as a resource, and feel free to contact me at any time to discuss these or, anything further. And I'm going to leave Taylor the last minute and a half or so to do her closing and upcoming webinars that I know she probably will do. But, thank you very much for attending, and again, feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Thank you, Christine, for an awesome webinar. We really appreciate it. Some information and a sneak peek of what's coming up. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, please be sure to join us on Friday, May 5th for the Accessibility Points, Ease for Empowerment. Also, please join us for this month for 2 webinars on digitization, tools and technologies for building digital collections on Tuesday, April 18th, and developing selection criteria and workflows for digital collections on Thursday, April 27th. We encourage you to look for upcoming webinars and workshops in the months ahead, and hope you are all able to join us for future training opportunities. As always, please feel free to keep checking our CE calendar on our website, the statewide training calendar, or look for your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a terrific weekend. Thank you, Diana.